Thanks, Tom. Sorry, it's my stage of life. I need to wear these. I'm an anthropologist too, but I'm a medical anthropologist. And so when all the colleagues were heading off to the Amazon, I was heading to London and looking at the National Sexual Lifestyles work back in the mid-90s with Kay Wellings. And medical anthropologists, we really are a weird bunch. Not saying that social anthropologists are, but we are. We study risks. We study populations and risks. Why do people do the things they do? And why do they do that at scale when it seems to be they're making some crazy decisions that doesn't make sense? What's going on? So a lot of my work has been around sexual health, but also drug taking in the UK as well. And a number of years ago, we developed something called Frank. How many of you have heard of Frank? Yeah? So that was part of the work I worked on initially, because we had a drugs helpline, which the average age of the callers was around 30. So it wasn't the kids, it wasn't the young people who this helpline was out there for. So that's where we came from with Frank. This morning it was amazing, and I will take away with me so much from everything we heard in all three speakers. This is going to be slightly more practical, 30 minutes, okay? So bear with me on this. You're going to have to do something. First thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to talk to the person next to you, and you're going to have to answer some questions. They're dead easy, or are they? It's true or false. And then, about halfway through, we're going to have a little break while I play with the IT and mutter about nothing ever seems to work. And you're going to watch a very short video. And I'm going to ask you to do something. Again, in your pairs, or you can do it in small groups. It doesn't matter. And then we're going to talk about what you just saw and why I showed that to you. Then I'm going to end, hopefully, on a little bit more of an upbeat note and just talk about some of the work we're doing in this space, and with a plea and a call for yourselves to go back as ambassadors and talk to others about what you've heard this morning and explain to others what harmful sexual behaviour is. And if I do my job, hopefully in the next half an hour, you'll be able to do that. Does that make sense? Okay. True or false? 15% of all sexual offences, I'm going to have to hold this down, 15% of all sexual offences against children and young people in the UK are committed by other children and young people in the UK. I'm making this even harder for you. True or false? The key number there is 15% of all child sexual abuse in the UK. Allegedly, the perpetrators are other children and young people under the age of 18. Person next to you. Okay, sorry, we don't have much time. You will get a chance to talk again. 15% of all CSA. What's the key thing we don't know here? 15% of reported. That makes a big difference, doesn't it? Because what do we know about child sexual abuse? What do we know about all sexual abuse? Yes, yes. So, do you think it's more or less? More, yes. How much more? Got a lot more, we've got a half. Shaking heads, not sure. There's no reason why you should be sure, because it is something we cannot be sure about the extent and nature of this because of the nature of this, as you'll see when we start talking about what it is. So if we're looking at the most recent crime and research statistics, you'd be looking at anywhere between 22 and 30% of convictions or cautions for child sexual abuse where the alleged individual involved is under the age of 18. Aha. So that's reported cautions or convictions. So if we look at a study back in 2011, which was a postcode sample, so 6,000 individuals, and when they looked at the subsample of those individuals who had suffered from child sexual abuse, proportion who then stated that the individual who had sexually abused them was also under the age of 18 was 66%. So, if we've got somewhere between 22 and 66%, the figure we tend to use by looking at the various pieces of research that we come across or commission is 1 in 3, a third. So it's the midway between some of these estimates, so the lower and the higher end. So 1 in 3 cases of all child sexual abuse is this type of behaviour. When I say this type of behaviour, the behind me now is the definition. This is the definition that we are currently using in our resources and we advocate for others to use. 2 key things in this definition. The first is the idea of developmentally inappropriate. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about sexual behaviour or sexualised behaviour you would not expect to see or witness from a child or young person of that age. It's developmentally inappropriate. But key to that is the fact that you need to know what developmentally appropriate sexualised behaviour is. You need to understand what a trajectory through normal child sexual development looks like. Because if you don't know what normal looks like, everything begins to look abnormal or problematic. So, there's an apologist there.
Why is it 18 and not 16?
Why is it 18?
Yeah, because the age of consent is 16.
The age of consent is 16, but we talk about age of adulthood in this, yeah. So, if you don't know what normal child sexual development looks like, then anything may look worrying or abnormal. When we're talking about sex and children, people don't like to put those 2 things together. So the idea, to many people, is that children and young people suddenly become sexual beings at an age, be it the 16 or the 18. And then before that, there's no such thing as sexualised thoughts or sexual behaviour in children and young people. That is a complete myth. You need to quash that immediately and also challenge that when others say that. But you do need to know what normal sexual development looks like. The second key thing on here is in the definition it says towards others or self. So an example of that might be a 10-year-old with a compulsive porn addiction. That is not going to be developmentally helpful to that child or young person in his future dealings or interactions with the wider world life and women and consent in general. So again, thinking about this definition, it tries to encompass what are we talking about, what types of harm are we thinking about. How many of you have come across a tool, early assessment tool called the Brook traffic light? Don't read this, it's impossible to read. It's just showing you the colours. So quick show of hands in the room. Yep, okay, great. So with the Brook traffic light, it's the idea about what should you expect at various ages and stages of child development. And it breaks it down into the various ages and stages of child development up to the age of 18. And it's a traffic light because you're talking about red, amber and green. Now again with the Brook, important things when we talk to people about understanding how a Brook traffic light works is just because a child is exhibiting a red behaviour does not make them a red child. We're talking about behaviours. The other thing is, just because you're seeing green behaviours doesn't mean you ignore it. So there may well be the opportunity for some sort of conversation, perhaps around consent, around protection, around what's going on. It doesn't mean just because it's green, you ignore it. So a couple of things that often come up with the Brook. Who's seen this? This is called the continuum. Thank you so much. The continuum of harmful sexual behaviour. This is something which talks about what types of behaviour sit under this umbrella term of harmful sexual behaviour. And that's what we're talking about today, an umbrella term for these types of behaviours. Now see, on the left there, we're talking about normal behaviours, and then moving across into inappropriate, problematic, abusive, and then violence on the far end. The reason we talk about a continuum is many of the behaviours, certainly we come across amongst children and young people in this cohort, are not the same types of behaviours. Okay, so we have to understand what we're seeing and ultimately trying to understand where this behaviour has come from. If you're thinking about what are the key differences on this continuum, the big one where we get involved at the NSPCC and our services would be on that cusp of problematic and abusive. So if you're thinking about the problematic behaviours, inappropriate and problematic, often with the problematic, and again, these are generalisations, these are not always the case, but often there's no overt victimisation involved in those behaviours. The behaviours, because they are often displayed by pre-adolescent children, they may be developmentally disruptive, They may also be sexually reactive, i.e. something's happened in that child's life that, and this is causing the behaviour to manifest. We'll come back to that in a minute. Often displaying these types of behaviours, particularly with young people, may cause distress not only to themselves but also within families, and there also may be victimisation of that child by peers, and also rejection of that child by families and carers, because this behaviour is difficult to understand. When we get to the abusive side of behaviour, that's where our Turn the Page harmful sexual behaviour teams would get involved, and that's where we're seeing an element of coercion, manipulation, power control and imbalance. And that power imbalance may come from age, so big differences in the age of the children involved, intelligence and ability, intellect, so learning difficulties. It could be race, it could be gender, it could seriously just be strength. And those are the sort of things that we're looking at in the cases when we're diagnosing in that sort of area. With these sort of behaviours, there's often potential for harm, be it physical or emotional. And we tend to see these types of behaviours again more into puberty, that's where we would come across. In these behaviours also there's often a complete lack of consent involved. Does that make sense, having a continuum? So, do you remember the traffic light and the continuum? Well, we put them over each other earlier in the year, and we made this resource for NHS staff. And the idea is that for the NHS workforce, there is this freely downloadable resource which talks about the types of behaviours that they will see and how they can think about triaging those and what action they need to take. So some of the things I've just said to you are distilled into this resource. We'll come back to this because it's quite important about why they got to the point of deciding that they needed something like this. I also have about 10 copies up here, hard copies, so if you want to take one away at the end, please come and see me. I mentioned that I wanted you to do a quick exercise for me, okay? I'm going to ask you, when I play this short video, to, again in your pairs or in groups, to watch this composite case study. So these are real children we've worked with. We've put the cases together to create Brandon. I want you to follow Brandon's story, and I want you, with a person next to you in a small group, to think about what sort of factors have impacted on Brandon's normal child development. What's gone on in his life up until this point when this incident happens that may have had a role in what Brandon did? Does that make sense? Okay, bear with me.
Brandon is 18 months old. He's in his cot crying, he's really hungry, and his nappy's wet. He wants his mummy. Sometimes mummy comes, but sometimes she doesn't. When she comes, she sometimes sings to Brandon and gives him cuddles, and this makes Brandon feel warm and safe. When mummy's really tired and sad, she feels like she can't get out of bed or cuddle Brandon. This makes Brandon feel scared and lonely. He doesn't know if mummy will come back. Daddy isn't there very much, but when he is there, he shouts a lot and makes mummy cry. Brandon and mummy are scared of daddy. Brandon is 3 years old. Mummy has a new baby called Sarah, and daddy doesn't live with them anymore. Sarah's daddy lives with them now, and mummy has even less time for Brandon. Brandon really misses mummy's cuddles, but Sarah has lots of cuddles from mummy and her daddy. Brandon's wondering where his daddy is. Brandon is 5 years old. He's very grown up now. He goes to school and looks after his little sister when mummy's tired. Brandon likes it when Sarah's daddy lets him watch TV and play on computer games with him. Brandon thinks it's really exciting when he sees fighting, kissing and cuddling on TV and in the games. But when he goes to bed, he thinks about what he's seen, and it makes him feel a bit scared and funny in his tummy. Brandon's also seen his mummy and Sarah's daddy shouting and fighting, and this really frightens him. After the fighting, Mummy and Sarah's daddy have loud cuddles in bed, and they don't wear any clothes. This also makes Brandon feel scared and funny in his tummy. He takes his sister into their bedroom when this is happening to keep her safe, and Brandon and Sarah cuddle in bed. Brandon is 6 years old. Brandon still cuddles Sarah in bed when something scary is happening. Sometimes Brandon takes off his clothes and asks Sarah to take off her clothes, just like Mummy and Sarah's daddy. When they cuddle really tightly, it feels safe and he has a tingling feeling in his willy. Brandon is 7 years old. He doesn't like school much and doesn't have many friends. He finds the work really hard because he worries a lot about what's happening at home. And one day, when he was really worried, he started to get the tingly feeling in his willy. When he was in the toilets, he asked another boy from his class for a cuddle without their clothes on. The other boy told the teacher, and the teacher told Mummy. Mummy told Brandon off when they got home, and Mummy said Brandon was just like his daddy. And this is bad, because Mummy says horrible things about Brandon's daddy. Brandon is 8 years old. One night, Brandon came downstairs to get a drink when Sarah's daddy was watching telly. Brandon saw a man and a woman having loud cuddles. The man's willy was really big, and the woman put it in her mouth. Sarah's daddy laughed and said that Brandon will love blowjobs when he's older. The next week, a new boy called Jack starts at school. Jack's really quiet and hasn't made any friends yet. Brandon offers to be his friend, and he's really happy because he's not had a best friend before. One day, when they're having a wee in the toilets, Brandon shows Jack his willy and asks him to put it in his mouth. He tells Jack that it's called a blowjob, that grown-ups do it, and it feels really nice. Jack doesn't want to and looks a bit scared. Brandon tells him that he has to do it if he wants to be his friend. He tells Jack that it's a secret. Brandon pushes Jack's head towards his willy, but Jack runs away.
Okay, in small groups, I'll just have a quick think about the sort of things you think have impacted on Brandon's life up until now. Okay. Okay. We are running out of time, so I'll just say, just very quickly, somebody might want to just say some of the things. I'll start with 10. Attachment. A massive issue, yeah. What other things jumped out for you?
I'm wondering how the school could have handled it differently rather than just telling the mother if there's anything they could have done to help the child.
Really interesting. This video is from some support and e-learning that we developed for primary schools. So this is where it's come from. And then my question when I said, why am I showing you this? Why am I showing you this? What am I getting you to think about here? It's that point about being able to recognise, record, respond and refer. Because if you don't know what I'm talking about and you don't recognise this, what two things do you think happen in schools? I'll tell you. Nothing? Yeah, completely ignored? Or panic? Yeah, panic. This is far too dangerous for us to be dealing with. Yeah.
Like it's a melding between like fear arousal and physical arousal. And
that's self-soothing. Going on. Do you remember the again from the presentation before with the monkeys and the cloth mother, the classic. So that self-soothing behaviour that's going on with his sister. And who's speaking to his sister about all of this?
What's the ending of the story?
What's the ending of the story? This is Brandon in primary school. There's a second one which is Brandon in secondary school, which, guess what, involves mobile phones and technology and things. That is the ending of the story. What we then do with this scenario is Jack discloses, and then they have to describe what they would do as a school to put in place protection around the case. Now, this is the point. This is the point I'm showing you this. Brandon has needs as well. Okay? We've seen them. Multiple needs through his life. So if we were working with Brandon and this case and Jack and the family, we'd be doing something about getting the balance right. And this is what you need to see. The balance is between addressing the risks. So will this behaviour happen or escalate or get worse? And the needs. How are we going to address some of the underlying issues that Brandon's faced, where this behaviour is manifested on, come from? And if we don't get the balance right, too much on the risks, then those needs are forgotten. And if we focus too much on the needs, the safety planning is not thought of. And again, that's not good either. So it's about the balance. But the key point about this...
Intervention is needed much earlier.
Sorry?
Intervention is needed much earlier.
Much earlier, yes.
You know, that
yes.
Distress began.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So it should not have got to this point, should it? No. And part of the NSPCC's work at the moment is around public health approaches to child sexual abuse. Exactly that. We need preventative approaches that are evidence-informed and are being rolled out rather than focusing on the reactive... Sure Start centres would be a good start. If you're listening over the road... Absolutely, absolutely. So... That's why we often show this. It's getting under the skin of this case and saying, don't just look at the behaviour, understand the child. Understand where this has come from. These were some of the things which come after the video. The reason we show this is we talk about the links between other types of child abuse and displays of harmful sexual behaviour. And you won't be surprised to see domestic violence on there, as well as other types of abuse such as neglect. And also... one of the myths that people often ask is, well, if a child's displaying this sort of behaviour, surely they've been sexually abused themselves. Well, between 40 and 50% of the cases we work with, NSPCC, there has been some sexual abuse, but not all cases. So it's not simply the explanation that that's what's gone on. You need to understand the wider histories of abuse in these cases, particularly amongst young girls who display harmful sexual behaviour, because often there's a very extensive abusive history. Yes. Yes, yes. And so the poor boundaries in the house, doors open when adults are having sex, showing a minor pornography. So again, yeah, there was a whole series of that going on. With the under-12s, we sadly are seeing more and more under-12s displaying this type of behaviour. And we come from the assessments we use, we're looking at where has it come from, where does it manifest from, thinking about Brandon's earlier life experiences. He's seen it, he's witnessed it or experienced it. What is it? We need to know what's gone on in that household or in that wider context to understand it and help deal with the behaviours. I just wanted to mention this. I know, Ness, I think it was you started talking about children with learning disabilities. A very, very vulnerable group of children, and often forgotten in all of this, but disproportionately represented in HSB cases. And in some recent research in 2013, Simon Hackett found that 38% of his 700 cases he looked at with HSB, the individuals involved had a learning disability. And it is Well, it's an outrage that in this country we do not have an intervention that has been evidence-based and works with this particular group of children and young people. At the NSPCC, we're bringing an intervention across from New Zealand, which does have an evidence base, and we're going to test it in the UK and see, can this work with children with learning difficulties and harmful sexual behaviour in the UK, and that's where we're going in the next few years, testing a service there. I just wanted to end on this, okay? We've talked a lot about child sexual exploitation, and I've talked for 25 minutes to you about harmful sexual behaviour. These two things linked? Yeah? Of course. So how come when we go around the country and we look at various responses to CSE, that's the big game in town, but nobody talks about harmful sexual behaviour. Nobody talks about the crossover. We're talking about two distinct types of child sex abuse, but with a huge crossover. So if we're thinking about one police force that we've been working with up in the northeast, if they did a snapshot look at the current numbers of CSE cases that have been classified by the police that they were working with, when they looked at the ages of the alleged individuals involved, 66% were under the age of 18. How come we're not talking about the crossovers here? How come we're not putting our heads together and thinking about the responses here and thinking about some of the work we could put in place here about treating some of this? And I was really struck, Sammy's Law, Sammy's Law earlier, about the idea of criminalising other children and young people who are involved in some of these types of activities without understanding where the behaviours come from and who are the adults behind this type of behaviour and where has it come from. So again, this idea of conceptually fragmenting all of this child sexual abuse is going to help nobody. We have to see the links and understand that these things are joined up and put our shoulders to the wheel and work out who knows what works. Let's share that. Let's understand how that works. But importantly, let's start coming up with some proper definitions for how these things link together, rather than conceptualizing things into silos and thus putting resources down these paths where we don't really attack these things head on. I'll end there because I think I've run out of time. But I do have some resources here if anyone wants to get them off me later.